She used to explain everything. Every silence, every shift in tone, every boundary she dared to place. Not to manipulate, but to protect. Herself. The other. The relationship. Freud might say it was a defense mechanism, a way of managing internal conflict through external appeasement. She spoke not for clarity, but for safety. If she could just explain herself well enough, maybe she wouldn't be left. Explaining was her offering, her currency in the emotional economy. Every time she was misunderstood, she rushed in to fix the rupture, to fill the silence with context, to mend the tension with justifications. It wasn't because she didn't know herself, it was because she feared being misread, misjudged, abandoned. Freud understood this fear well. To him, the compulsion to explain is often rooted in the unconscious need for approval, for love, conditioned on comprehension. So she translated her inner world tirelessly. She gave background, disclaimers, softened truths with cushions of empathy. She made her anger palatable, her hurt polite. She edited her tone, rehearsed her words, circled back to clarify. And every time she did, a small part of her wondered, would he have done the same for me? But she kept explaining. Because deep down, there was a child inside her still hoping to be understood by someone who never quite heard her. A ghost of a parent, a past lover, a shadow of abandonment that taught her, if they misunderstand you, they will leave. So she overfunctioned, overcommunicated, overexplained. And what did it cost her? Time, energy, dignity, the erosion of her instinct. She began to mistrust her own no, her own silence, her own discomfort, because to honor them without explanation felt too bold, too final. Freud might say she was governed by a superego shaped by guilt, a punishing inner voice that demanded justification for her own feelings. She explained her boundaries, hoping they would be respected. They weren't. She explained her silence, hoping it would be met with patience. It wasn't. She explained her disappointment, hoping it would inspire change. It didn't. And still she spoke. Still she translated. Until one day, she didn't. There's a shift that happens when a woman stops explaining herself. It doesn't arrive loudly. It begins in the body, in the pause before she replies, in the breath she chooses to keep, in the moment she decides that her truth does not require translation, that being misunderstood is not always her burden to carry. She doesn't become cruel. She becomes quiet, not withdrawn but grounded. Freud might say her ego has strengthened, now capable of mediating between the needs of her ID and the moral pressure of her superego. She no longer explains every no. She simply says it. She no longer narrates her discomfort. She honors it. This silence, this refusal to over-explain, often disorients those around her, especially those who benefited from her constant clarifications. He may accuse her of being cold, distant, difficult, but she is none of those things. She is clear, and clarity, to the confused, often feels like cruelty. As she stops explaining, she begins to reclaim her time. The hours once spent drafting texts in her head, practicing conversations, softening edges, they are now hers. She uses them to read, to rest, to walk in stillness. Freud's idea of sublimation comes to life here, the transformation of once compulsive behavior into creative energy. Her voice, no longer spent on justification, begins to write poetry, to whisper boundaries, to say only what matters. She realizes something profound. Those who love her don't need a thesis to honor her limits. Those who care will not require a monologue to respect her feelings. Those who are safe don't make her work so hard to be known. This is not arrogance. It is healing. It is the end of emotional labor that was never reciprocated. The end of placating discomfort. The end of trying to be palatable. Freud believed much of our suffering came from a tension between what we desire and what we feel we must repress. She no longer represses her truth with the pressure to make it acceptable. She no longer needs everyone to understand. She only needs to understand herself. And in that there is freedom. Not because she's detached, but because she's integrated. Her inner child is no longer begging to be heard. She is being held, finally, by the woman she has become. She doesn't need to explain why she's walking away, why she's quieter, why she doesn't respond to breadcrumbs or tolerate emotional ambiguity. Her silence is not a game. It's a boundary, a sacred perimeter around her worth. And if they ask why she changed, she won't write an essay. She won't draft a speech. She'll offer a soft smile, maybe, or a single sentence, or nothing at all. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can say is nothing. Freud was right. What we do not speak becomes symptom. But when we stop over-speaking, when we reclaim our right to be understood without effort, the symptom dissolves. In its place, serenity. And so she walks forward. Not loudly, but whole. It doesn't look like a revolution at first. It looks like a pause. A skipped reply. A smile withheld. The absence of elaboration. But in truth, it is the birth of a boundary. Subtle, sacred, and long overdue. When a woman stops explaining herself, she is not just reclaiming her words. She is reclaiming her space. Freud wrote extensively about the development of the ego as the boundary maker between inner desires and outer demands. In her past, that ego was porous. She absorbed others' discomfort, took in their confusion, took responsibility for their lack of understanding. She thought if she could explain well enough, thoroughly enough, she could prevent rejection, or disapproval, or abandonment. But now, she sees, the need to explain is often a trauma response masquerading as maturity. And so her boundaries emerge, not with declarations but with choices. She says no, and says no more. She cancels plans without guilt, declines calls without follow-up texts. She sets time aside without needing others to approve how she spends it. Her life becomes less about managing perceptions and more about honoring intuition. It's not that she's become rigid. It's that she's become rooted. Freud's theory of individuation, though later developed more fully by Jung, begins here, where a woman stops trying to fit into others' narratives and instead authors her own. Her boundaries aren't walls. They're architecture, the shape of her freedom. To those who benefited from her over-explaining, this new clarity feels abrupt, cold even. They may ask questions, press for reasons, accuse her of being distant or dramatic. But she no longer owes a performance to stay in anyone's comfort zone. The compulsion to explain was never truly about dialogue. It was about survival. Now she's not surviving. She's living. Her yes becomes cleaner. Her no sharper. She doesn't fear the discomfort of others anymore. Freud might suggest that her superego, the internalized voice of societal and familial rules, has softened. She no longer hears it as a punitive force. It no longer demands she sacrifice self for peace. Instead, her ego, matured, steps in, balances self-expression with self-preservation. And her body responds. Where there was once tension, there is breath. Where there was anxiety, there is rest. She no longer scripts emotional TED Talks in her head, rehearsing justifications in the shower. She no longer panics when someone doesn't agree with her choice. Her nervous system calms. The body knows when the self is safe. Boundaries, Freud might argue, are psychic skin. Without them, everything seeps in. Criticism, doubt, emotional debris. But with them, clarity returns. She no longer absorbs moods that aren't hers. No longer bends to preserve harmony at the cost of truth. Her relationships shift. Some fade. Others deepen. Because what remains are connections not built on her self-abandonment, but on mutual respect. She also becomes less tolerant of emotional manipulation. Guilt trips fall flat. Gaslighting loses its grip. When she stopped explaining herself, she stopped handing out tools for others to twist her narrative. Silence became her gatekeeper. Stillness, her sword. Not everything deserves an answer. Not every accusation merits a reply. There is grief, of course. A mourning of the version of herself that thought love had to be earned through exhaustion. That believed connection required constant interpretation. She honors that version, not with shame, but with compassion. She was doing what she knew. But now she knows more. And that knowledge builds the backbone of her new life. In stopping the explanations, she makes space for listening. Not to others, but to herself. She hears her fatigue, her longing, her anger, her wisdom. And from this listening, her boundaries shape themselves. No longer reactions. They are now rituals, practices, expressions of sacred self-regard. And Freud, ever the observer of inner contradictions, might say this is where true freedom lies, not in abandoning desire, but in shaping it, directing it, making peace between what we feel and what we choose. She is not at war with her world anymore. She is just no longer willing to shrink for it. So when they ask her why she's changed, she won't explain. Not out of pride, but out of principle. She doesn't need them to understand her boundary. She only needs to uphold it. Because for the first time, she feels whole. And wholeness doesn't require permission. There comes a moment, a subtle, seismic shift, when her silence stops being a symptom of defeat and becomes a symbol of sovereignty. It is not the silence of confusion, nor of passivity. It is not a weapon, nor a withdrawal. It is an arrival. Freud once wrote that where ID was, ego shall be. In this silence, her ego is not silenced, it is seated. Fully, calmly, without apology, she no longer seeks to be deciphered. No longer lays out a trail of verbal breadcrumbs, hoping someone will follow her into the nuance of her emotions. She used to think silence meant being ignored. Now, she sees that silence can be a container, a throne, a boundary lined with grace. Her stillness is misunderstood by many. Some think she's given up. Others call her aloof, guarded hard. But what they don't see is what Freud might call sublimation in action. She has taken the psychic energy once spent on explanation and turned it inward, toward refinement, creativity, discernment. She no longer pours herself out hoping to be validated. She pours herself into the sacred stillness of becoming. In this space, her time becomes deliberate, her conversations intentional. She no longer needs to defend her worth with paragraphs. Her value is not up for negotiation. She doesn't chase after closure anymore. Closure is internal. Forgiveness is personal. She doesn't need their understanding to find her peace. Silence for her is no longer emptiness. It is presence. Freud might have said the unconscious reveals itself not only in slips of the tongue, but in what is left unsaid. Her silence speaks volumes. It says, I am no longer trying to convince you. I am no longer auditioning for love. I am no longer sacrificing myself to keep a version of you comfortable. She watches more, responds less. She walks away not with dramatics, but with finality. When he asks what's wrong and she says nothing, it's not manipulation, it's truth. Nothing is wrong anymore. She simply doesn't see the need to explain a decision made in alignment. Her energy shifts. It is no longer scattered across dozens of mini apologies. No longer bleeding into the cracks of another's emotional unavailability. She feels powerful, not because she controls others, but because she finally controls the direction of her presence. She gives it where it is received, withdraws it where it is drained. This evolution disturbs those who depended on her self-doubt, those who mistook her explaining for permission to mistreat, who heard her softness and assumed she would never leave. But Freud reminds us, what we repress returns. Her silence is the return of all the things she once buried, her anger, her intuition, her truth. But now it returns refined, not rageful, rooted. She no longer overextends. She doesn't rush to fill silence with answers, doesn't rush to correct misperceptions. When they misunderstand her silence, she lets them. Because she finally knows, anyone who needs her to constantly explain herself does not intend to understand her. They intend to control her. And so she lets go. Not out of bitterness, but out of alignment. She walks away with dignity, not declarations. Her sovereignty is not loud. It is steady. In her silence, she writes poems, starts businesses, heals her body, calls in friends who speak her language of depth and ease. This is not emotional detachment. It is emotional adulthood. Freud believed that true maturity is measured not by compliance, but by integration, the capacity to hold feeling and thought in tension and choose action from alignment. She does just that. She no longer needs to be seen to feel real. Her silence is not armor. It is embodiment, not a defense, but a decision. She doesn't ghost, she fades. Quietly, peacefully, because she knows the difference between being needed and being known, between being used and being loved. And if they ever return, seeking access again, she won't scream. She won't write a letter. She won't explain. She will smile, maybe, nod, and keep walking. Because sovereignty doesn't beg. It simply is. She was once emotionally indebted. Not in obvious ways, but in the quiet, aching spaces where she felt responsible for others' comfort, for their reactions, for their wounds. Freud might say this was her superego at war with her autonomy, a punishing voice urging her to keep the peace, even when it cost her clarity. She explained herself to soften the blow of her boundaries, to ensure no one felt abandoned, rejected, misunderstood. She explained so she wouldn't feel guilty. But emotional debt is a soul tax, and over time, the interest accumulates. She found herself drained after every conversation, every interaction that required her to shrink her truth into something palatable. Every explanation became a small betrayal of instinct, of intuition, of integrity. The debt grew silently, and then one day, she checked the balance, and it was bankrupt. When she stopped explaining, she declared emotional bankruptcy. Not out of avoidance, but as an act of reclamation. She realized she owed no one an explanation for how she chose to protect her peace. That her no was not cruel. Her yes, not obligatory. That her decisions were valid even when they made others uncomfortable. Especially then. This shift did not make her careless. It made her careful. She chose her words the way one chooses seeds for a garden, intentionally, knowing each one would grow something. If it wasn't going to bear fruit, she wouldn't plant it. She wouldn't speak it. She no longer explained things she knew they wouldn't truly hear. She saved her voice for those who listen with care. Freud might call this ego strength, the capacity to tolerate disapproval without collapsing, to tolerate misinterpretation without compulsively correcting, to let others have their opinions while remaining rooted in one's own. She was no longer trying to manage their emotions, only her own. She saw how often women are trained to carry the weight of others' fragility. How often she was praised for her ability to soothe, to smooth things over, to be the emotional buffer. But what looked like grace was often erasure. What looked like emotional intelligence was, in truth, survival. And she was done surviving. She began to see that some relationships thrived only when she stayed in debt. Only when she over-explained, over-accommodated, over-functioned. And so, she let those relationships dissolve. Not out of vengeance, but because they were built on imbalance. Freud taught us that repression creates symptoms. Her symptom had been exhaustion. Her cure now was silence. She paid back what she owed to herself. Time, rest, space, boundaries, pleasure. Her explanations had once been a currency she used to buy closeness. Now, she saw that true connection doesn't require payment. It requires presence. And presence doesn't need justification. She no longer feared being misunderstood. She feared losing herself in the process of being liked. That fear evaporated. What remained was discernment. She spoke less, but her words carried weight. She shared less, but what she shared was sacred. Not everyone gets access. Not everyone gets the explanation. That was the new economy of her soul. She now views her silence as a spiritual act. Not withdrawal, but refinement. Not rejection, but redirection. Freud believed that the unconscious governs much of our behavior. And hers had governed her into people-pleasing, into explaining, as a form of control. But now, her awareness made space for new choices. She reclaims her narrative without commentary. She leaves rooms without excuses. She sets boundaries without annotations. Her integrity is intact even when unacknowledged. Because she knows the truth, explanations often aren't about clarity. They're about control. And she no longer needs to control how she's perceived, only how she lives. And in that, she is finally free. There is a sacred shift in a woman's life when she realizes her words are not instruments of persuasion. They are artifacts of her truth. Once she used language like armor, like bridge, like offering. She shaped sentences to soothe discomfort, to ward off rejection, to prove she was worthy of tenderness. Freud would call this sublimated fear, a psychic compromise to avoid loss. But now, her words belong to her, not to the world, not to their approval. To her. This transformation is not loud. It does not arrive with declarations. It begins quietly, in the spaces where she once wrote long texts explaining her silence, her choices, her pain. It begins in the breath she takes before speaking, asking, "Do I owe them this? Or am I defaulting to an old wound?" She speaks now with economy, precision, not to be heard, but to express, not to correct perceptions, but to honor truth. Her language softens, paradoxically, even as it becomes more powerful. She is no longer interested in winning arguments. She no longer needs to clarify things that were always clear to her. Freud once said that the ego is not master in its own house. But when she stopped explaining, she began to reclaim that mastery, not through domination, but through discernment. Her voice, once used as a lifeline, now becomes a lantern. She does not shout to be seen. She illuminates. And those who walk with her will recognize the light, not because she demands it, but because it radiates. She knows now that being understood is not always possible. And more importantly, it is not always necessary. Some people will choose confusion because understanding would require change. She lets them. She no longer performs intimacy for those unwilling to earn it. This reclamation does not mean she's cold. It means she's warm inwardly, generous inwardly, because she is no longer hemorrhaging explanations outward. She tends to her own narrative. She chooses her audience. She honors the cost of expression by refusing to waste it on those who will weaponize it. Freud believed that what is repressed returns. And in her case, it returned as anger, as fatigue, as despair, but also as power. Once, she repressed her truth to keep the peace. Now, she speaks it to preserve her peace. And where there is no reception, she walks away. She no longer requires closure in conversation. Her closure is the clarity that arises when she stops begging to be seen, when she stops translating herself into a dialect they can digest. She returns to her native language, of silence, of intuition, of inner authority. And for the first time, her voice feels like hers. Not a tool for explanation. A prayer. A threshold. A spell. Spoken not to convince, but to conjure. She writes differently now. Loves differently. Even her laughter has changed. It's less about being liked, more about being alive. And if someone asks why she changed, she may offer a small smile. Or she may say nothing, because her life now answers the question her words used to chase. And that, Freud might say, is the end of repression, and the beginning of becoming. If her silence spoke to you, let this be your reminder. You are allowed to live without explanation. Like what you heard, like this video, subscribe for more, and share your voice in the comments below. Your words may light the way for someone else.